The Castro regime in Cuba, despite its many achievements during its time in areas like economics, equality, and education, failed to make good on the changes promised to the Cuban people, and that's a failure that still impacts many Cubans today. Before the 20th century, Cuba was a Spanish colony until Cubans started a revolution in 1868, and despite proclaimed U.S. neutrality, the Americans would smuggle in weapons and people to aid the Cubans in their revolt. And although the Spanish had won this, they granted Cuba a greater economic independence, which allowed for U.S. investors to pour money into the island. As a result of this, Cuba was much more integrated into American society despite being a colony of Spain. Then, in 1895, the U.S. went to war with Spain as a result of two big things. Number one being sensationalized journalism called yellow journalism, which popularized American sympathy with the Cuban people and their independence movement. And number two being the convenient explosion of the USS Maine in the Havana harbor in Cuba. This, by today's viewpoint, is thought to have been an accident. Back then, it was very clearly the Spanish at fault. And in the Treaty of Paris, Cuba gained independence but endured U.S. military occupation until 1902, in which the signing of the Platt Amendment on May 20th gave Cuba a more formal independence. Cuba's economy at the time was heavily dependent on its one main export, sugar. It was also economically dominated by the United States. 60% of its sugar production belonged to American companies, and 95% of their sugar exports went to America. This left Cuba not only dependent on sugar, but on the U.S. to keep their economy afloat. And prior to Castro, Cuba was seen as America's playground and was known as the Las Vegas before Las Vegas. And especially in the 1920s, when it opened up to American tourism, this spurred a rise in casinos and fancy hotels with casinos inside of them that were partly funded by the Batista regime at the time. The people who profited from the ventures of the casinos and the fancy hotels were the Cuban elites, state banks, American Union funds, and the infamous American Mafia. The majority of Cubans couldn't partake in the gambling or the luxurious hotels or the drugs smuggled into Cuba by the Mafia because they couldn't afford it. The ones who could were wealthy white Cubans. This was one of the biggest problems in Cuba at the time, was its racial inequalities, which there was a disproportionate distribution of wealth between white and black Cubans. Black Cubans were often subject to extreme poverty, a lack of health care, and a lack of education. There were also several other issues prior to Castro, including issues with women and their rights. Cuba at the time had a very patriarchal society prior to Castro, and women were often reduced to more traditional roles like homemaking and childcare. They were barred from active participation in politics and activism. And the Great Depression, however, allowed for women to push for further activism and equality, beyond what little they had been given after their independence movement at the end of the 19th century. Another big issue in Cuba at the time prior to Castro was its literacy and education. And although it had the fourth highest literacy rate in Latin America, having 76% of its population be literate, its illiteracy was widespread, and those who could attend schools very rarely made it past the second grade. A lot of these issues were targeted in Castro's regime to be fixed. Starting with the economics, Cuba's economy saw a gradual increase in GDP, gross domestic product, over time, which is good because it went up. Another issue that Castro sought to fix was the racial issues. Castro outlawed all forms of racial discrimination in areas like employment and education, and he also worked to increase the number of Afro-Cuban representatives in the government, increasing the percentage of black members on the Council of State from 12.9% in 1976 to 25.8% by 2003. The third area in which there were a lot of problems being women and their rights that Castro sought to fix was how he did this was by encouraging active participation from women in Cuban society and providing them with education, job training, free housing, and childcare for those in the workforce. Speaking of, education and that being provided, that was the fourth area that Castro sought to improve. Castro promoted strong reforms in the education part of Cuban life, and the effects of such are seen today in Cuba, with an increased literacy rate of 99.67 as of 2021. Now, all of these reforms seem, good and well, and it seemed like it was pretty successful, but it wasn't enough. So what went wrong? Well, the Cuban economy would later begin to fail with the collapse of the Soviet Union, had been pouring a lot of money and military aid into Cuba, and a U.S. embargo has made tough times for Cuba's economy. And although that Castro had himself claimed that racism had been eradicated, he refuted his own claim, saying that it was premature. Even though great developments in the legal terms of racial inequality were made, social equality was not achieved. Afro-Cubans lack cultural representation and suffer from police brutality, and housing in their racial quarter lags behind. And today, other than other issues that were discussed, women in the workforce most often make the minimum end of wages at high-paying jobs compared to their male counterparts. Women are also much less represented in the government than Cubans are led to believe. And even though women have been encouraged to participate in society through politics and jobs, a woman working full-time is still expected to do all the housework and childcare just the same. Although the Castro regime made many beneficial changes to Cuban society, it still left much to be desired from its initial promises. The people of Cuba were promised an equal society, but were left with disproportionate inequalities with race and sex, as well as economic inequalities and difficulties that still plague Cuba today.